Happy Monday, everybody. Hope you're all doing well. Every Monday, I do my best of one, best of three meta review for standard. So we're on to week 10 of Foundations. And what I like to do is I like to use a third party tracker called Untapped. And I've noticed people like MTG Joe likes to do like Diamond to Mythic. And I will be doing the top performing decks from Bronze to Mythic. And I'll also talk about the changes throughout the weeks so you can kind of understand what might be considered part of the core, while kind of what is being added in just this one week. If the card is being added in, it is less likely to be a safe craft, a consistent craft, or not considered part of the core. And I'll also be covering best of three decks and kind of covering some of their sideboard strategies if you're prepping for an RCQ. So with that, let's get started. And number one in tier one, according to Untapped, is still mono red aggro. This list has been doing quite well since the core of it was developed in the World Championship. And this week, what we see is one Hired Claw has been dropped. The two Urbrask's Forge, which were being explored, have been dropped as well, going up to 4 copies of the Witchstalker Frenzy, which is usually at 3, and then returning the lands back to 21. Last week we saw a exploration of dropping the lands to 19, which I think was a little bit greedy and a little bit low. So the other thing that I like to do is cover the matchups in case you're new or returning to Magic the Gathering, as well as give you kind of my mulligan strategy for what I look for in my opening hand. So this mono red aggro is favored against Dimir Bounce, mono black discard, Azorius Oculus, Domain, Azorius Control, and Golgari midrange. It is a coin flip against Selesnya Rabbits, which is relatively new. It used to be favored against Selesnya Rabbits, but Hinterland Sanctifier and Sheltered by Ghosts have kind of changed that matchup. And it is weak to mono black midrange. They have the interaction to disrupt the synergies of the mice, by using removal on Manifold Mouse and Heartfire Hero. And it is weak to Boros Auras, which gains too much life, and the Sheltered by Ghosts then can be problematic unless you have the Shock to play in response and get a 2-for-1. The Sheltered by Ghosts gives this deck some problems. And the opening hand, I look for the Heartfire Hero and the Hired Claw. Number 2, according to Untapped, in Tier 1 is Selesnya Rabbits. And really the reason why we see this climb up into Tier 1 is because it is a good matchup against the Dimir Bounce deck, which has grown quite a bit in popularity in the last couple of weeks. So this one we see the War Leader has been dropped by 1. Sometimes we see this fluctuate, and playing the Phineas instead is another change that we've seen throughout the weeks, and an additional copy of the Sanguine Evangelist. And the Season of the Burrow, which is sometimes included as a little bit of top end, has been cut from here. And then we see a rework of the lands. So Cavern of Souls has been dropped down to 2. I like that because one of your turn 1 plays is a Frog Warrior and is not a rabbit like the rest of the deck. And so that can be a little bit awkward if you need to use the Cavern of Souls for green for the Valley Mightcaller. And we're dropping a forest and a lupine village, which is the land that gets you additional dig later in the game, to bring in 3 copies of Brushland, which is the Selesnya Painland, and a 4th copy of the Razorverge Thicket, which is the Selesnya Fastland. So Selesnya Rabbits is a go-wide strategy. It is favored against Dimir Bounce because the recurring single-point interaction of that deck is overwhelmed by the go-wide. It is also favored against mono black discard, domain, and Golgari midrange. It's a coin flip against mono red aggro. Again, this one is not running the Hinterland Sanctifier or the Sheltered by Ghosts, so take that with a grain of salt. That this version I think has been historically weak to mono red aggro, but when we're talking about the archetype at large, you have to include the alternatives that are in the archetype as well. So it's a coin flip against mono black midrange, punishing the single point interaction like the Dimir midrange strategy. And then it's weak, and I mean really weak, to Boros Auras. And this deck does not have any single point interaction to be able to disrupt the turn 2 Sheltered by Ghosts, which then just has too much lifelink and gets too out of control. This deck is definitely looking to start at turn 1, and Valley Mightcaller and Paw Patch Recruit are the cards that I look for in my opening hand. And in Tier 1, we see Mono Red Goblins, which has been hanging out in Tier 2 for a while. And again, this is because it is a favored matchup against the Dimir Bounce deck. And So this week we see the Dropkick Bomber has been dropped by 1 copy to bring in 2 copies of Krenko Mob Boss, but not bringing in Agatha's Soul Cauldron, just bringing this in as some decent top end. We're also dropping the interaction, or I should say changing the interaction from the 4 copies of Torch the Tower for 4 copies of Burst Lightning. Torch the Tower has the upside of exiling, whereas Burst Lightning has the upside of being able to go face, as well as be kicked for the 4 damage. And we're also dropping the 2 copies of the Painter's Studio, which is kind of the go wide board pump, gives all of your creatures +1/+0, and then gives you additional dig on the defaced gallery side of the room. And we're bringing in a 1 additional mountain, bringing up the land because we're bringing in Krenko, making the deck a little bit more expensive. So this strategy is favored against mono black midrange, whereas the mono red aggro is not favored against mono black midrange. This is because this is more of a go wide strategy with Squee and Seer Slicer Goblin. And it's also favored against mono black discard and Dimir Bounce. And again, punishing the single point interaction. And it's weak against mono red aggro. You are a slower deck than the mono red aggro strategy. And then similar to the mono red strategy, you are weak to Boros Auras. If they get the sheltered ghosts down on a target through your burst lightning, this can be a problem. So if you have the Fanatical Firebrand, it may be good to keep that one untapped so that you can tap it in response to remove their target if they go to enchant like an Optimistic Scavenger or a Heartfire Hero. Something to keep in mind. And this is a relatively new archetype, but we're starting to see a little bit more differentiation in what the best cards are in your opening hand. And the Seer Slicer Goblin has really started to shine. And to get this one to work, you need your 1-drops, and your best 1-drops are the Cacophony Scamp and your Reckless Lackey. And now for Tier 2, so number 4 in Tier 2 is Mardu Aggro. If we look at the list here, nothing has changed. This is basically the Boros Auras strategy, but you're adding in the Callous Sellsword to be able to fling a creature at your opponent. This deck is favored against mono red aggro, similar to Boros Auras. It's a coin flip against Dimir Midrange, or the Dimir Bounce deck. And if I say Dimir Midrange, Dimir Midrange has largely become Dimir Bounce. So I'm still saying Dimir Bounce instead of Dimir Midrange because occasionally you do bump into the older version of Dimir Midrange, but by and large we're seeing it being favored over the old version. And then it's weak against mono black midrange, being punished by the single point interaction, largely leading to 2-for-1s whenever you go to play one of your auras. The opening hand, looking for Manifold Mouse and Heartfire Hero. Because the shelter, and notably that's a change throughout the weeks. I was saying Heartfire Hero into Sheltered by Ghosts or Optimistic Scavenger into Sheltered by Ghosts was sometimes a stronger line depending on the meta. This week, though, because we see more of that Dimir Bounce, the Nowhere to Run has made the Sheltered by Ghosts quite a bit weaker. It's still a decent card in some matchups like Mono Red Aggro, but keep that in mind, it's a little bit worse than it used to be a couple weeks ago. Number 5 in Tier 2 is Boros Auras, and we see the return back to 2 copies of Atali's Favor instead of 3, and we see kind of the budget version of the lands, so we're dropping 3 copies of the Battlefield Forge and 1 copy of the Inspiring Vantage to run 2 mountains and 3 plains. The overall strategy for this one is favored against Mono Red Aggro because of the Sheltered by Ghosts. It's also favored against Domain, Azorius Oculus, and Selesnya Rabbits. It's a coin flip against Mono Black Discard and Golgari midrange, largely if they, depending on whether or not you get the Sheltered by Ghosts down. And then it's weak against Mono Black midrange, which can more consistently disrupt you getting the Sheltered by Ghosts down. It's also weak to the Dimir Bounce deck, being able to just go through the Sheltered by Ghosts strategy with Nowhere to Run. And then it's also weak to Azorius Control, which has the Sweeper Temporary Lockdown, which is particularly problematic for this deck. And similarly, it used to be Heartfire Hero into Sheltered by Ghosts, but because of the Dimir Bounce prevalence, now I can say that the only card that is for sure what you should be looking for in your opening hand is Heartfire Hero. Your next best performing cards are Sheltered by Ghosts and Manifold Mouse, but they have taken a hit this week, which is why we see it in Tier 2 instead of Tier 1. Number 6, according to Untapped, in Tier 2 is Rakdos Aggro, this being kind of a faster version or a more pure aggro, dropping the disruptive elements of mono red to win the game a turn sooner, off of the Slick Shot Show Off into the Fling, or Cacophony Scamp and Heartfire Hero into the Fling. So if we look at the list here compared to last week, we see no changes. So since we're so far into the meta, I'm kind of glancing over a lot of these instead of going through each card. So you can go back in the weeks prior if you want a more in-depth look at each archetype, especially the closer you get to week 1. So this matchup is favored against mono red aggro, again because of dropping the disruptive elements to win a turn sooner. It's a coin flip against the Dimir Bounce deck and Boros Auras, and it is weak to mono black midrange. So them having this single point interaction to be able to disrupt what you were going to fling is particularly problematic for this deck. And the opening hand, I look for Turn Inside Out and the Manifold Mouse and the Heartfired Hero, although I usually run a version that has more than just one Manifold Mouse. The Slick Shot Show Off is also particularly good in your opening hand if you have the Fling and a combat trick, because you need 2 combat tricks and the Fling to get a turn 3 win with the Slick Shot Show Off. And we continue to see Dimir Bounce having its effect on the meta, because we have Azorius Oculus has returned to the top 8, which we haven't seen since like week 2. And so Azorius Oculus has gone through some changes since we talked about it last. So it's running the 2 copies of the Kiora, the Rising Tide, which was explored at the beginning of Foundations, largely in best of 3. Has some decent synergies with the Threshold, being able to enable fodder for your Oculus. Sometimes it's included, sometimes not included. This one's bringing up the 3rd copy of the Recommission, which has become pretty standard. Most of the lists that I see are running 4 Helping Hand and 3 Recommission. We also see a change in the interaction of the deck. So we're dropping the Afara's Dispersal and into the Floodmaw, which were both pretty good at disrupting the Rakdos Aggro and mono red strategies, which were more prevalent at the beginning of Foundations. And we're also dropping the 2 copies of the Phantom Interference, which helped out against the sweepers, which we also are seeing less of. And we're dropping the 4 copies of the Soul Partition, which has been my favorite interaction for this archetype. And instead we're bringing in the 2 copies of Get Lost and bumping up the Unsummon to 4 copies. And the advantage of the Unsummon is it can target your own creatures. So that's kind of the answer. Instead of counterspelling the sweeper, we just bounce our Oculus or our Djinn to our hand in response to a Wrath. The lands have also gotten a rework, and I would say that this is kind of a budget version of the lands compared to what we typically see. So if you want to kind of reverse engineer this, I'll list the changes. So we're dropping the 4 A Darker Wastes, the 3 Flood Farm Verge, the 2 Meticulous Archive, and 3 Seachrome Coasts to bring in a bunch of the cheaper lands like the Abandoned Campground, 2 islands, 3 copies of the Lonely Oreo, and the 2 plains, and 1 copy of the Temple of Enlightenment, which was explored for a little bit, but the Surveil is usually better than the Scry for your tap land, and 4 copies of Tranquil Cove. Sorry for the duplicates. Arena does that unless I go in and favorite each one. So this is also just kind of a budget land. So we'll be covering Azorius Oculus in best of 3, and you can kind of see the more traditional land approach if you want to do the more expensive version. And then you can also go back to week 2 and look at the Azorius Oculus from there if you want to kind of reverse engineer the lands. So this archetype is favored against mono black midrange, being able to bring things back that have been destroyed by the single point interaction. And so this archetype is then also favored against the Dimir Bounce deck. And so if you're struggling against that archetype, you may want to check out some of these alternatives that are showing up that are the counter to the Dimir Bounce strategy. It is weak to mono red aggro and Boros Auras, and so since Boros Auras is weak to Dimir Bounce, that also we see a decrease in the popularity of Boros Auras, which allows Azorius Oculus to then be better positioned in the meta. And its opening hand, you're looking for Soul Partition, which is gone. Founding the Third Path, which helps enable your mill to start getting value out of your graveyard, and turn 3 Oculus is kind of the name of the game. You can even get a turn 2 Oculus off of playing the tap land that surveils into a turn 2 recommission or a helping hand. So that's why I really like the surveil lands in this archetype. It's a little cheeky. It doesn't happen very often, but when it does, it feels so good. And we're also Chart a Course is particularly nice. If you have one of your animation targets in your hand, Chart a Course guarantees that that gets into the graveyard and helps you dig for your recommission or your helping hand. And in 8th, in Tier 2, is Gruul Delirium. And this is the first time that I get to talk about Gruul Delirium in the top 8. It's been around for a little bit, but usually not making it into the top 8. And the core of the deck, I think, is really centered around fear of missing out, with the Delirium of being able to declare an additional attack. So this can be a particularly spicy card when you're pairing it in with something like Violent Urge that gives you double strike when you have Delirium. Monstrous Rage on one of your Wicker Folk is still hitting for 7 damage twice. You can hit your opponent pretty hard once you get Delirium enabled. And then a lot of the other cards are to enable the Delirium, and I think the addition of the Pop Hatch Recruit has actually helped this deck a lot. So kind of punishing the single point interaction of mono black, and Rebel Belt Maverick is one that we usually see in Golgari Roots, and this deck has usually been favoring the Cenote Scout, which can do the Explore on turn 1, and instead this is leaning into Surveil 2, which helps get more into your graveyard sooner. So I like the addition of the Maverick over the Cenote Scout. Patchwork Beastie is one of your key Delirium cards, especially getting this out on turn 1. We do have one copy of Torch the Tower for a little Hail Mary of single point interaction. Seed of Hope also enables the mill while gaining you life, and then you can pull important cards back to your hand. Wicker Folk comes in with as a 4/3 haste if you have Delirium. Breakout allows you to hit any of your 2 or less mana value 2 or less and put it into the battlefield attack like with haste, so you can immediately attack. And otherwise, it just gives you good dig. Beastie Beatdown also allows you to it's like a fight spell or a bite spell, dealing damage equal to the power. Gives you a little bit of interaction. I'm curious about the Beastie Beatdown over, say, like a Torch the Tower. It does allow you to remove maybe a larger, like 3 toughness creature. Keen-Eyed Curator as a 1-of in here too gives you a little bit against the graveyard strategies like Azorius Oculus that we're seeing increasing, as well as the Omniscience decks that I covered in my Meta Breaker yesterday. And so I wouldn't be surprised if you actually see Keen-Eyed Curator kind of come up, and I might be tempted to take out the Torch the Tower and the Beastie Beatdown and run it as a purely linear strategy with low disruption to bring in more things like the Keen-Eyed Curator, especially because it has a colorless activation to attack the graveyard instead of the Scavenging Ooze that has to be green. NT also helps you enable your Delirium, allowing you to discard a card, and then we have the Fly Trap, which if you have Delirium can create a lot of counters on your creatures. And the Huntsman's Redemption is one that I don't usually see this one in the archetype, but I like it. You know, you're creating a 3/3 for 3, and then you're searching for a land, and then sacrificing a creature can enable your Delirium, especially if you sacrifice something like an artifact creature that counts for 2, and then 2 creatures getting +2/+2 and trample can time really well with your fear of missing out, trying to win on turn 5, to go for the 1-turn kill. So kind of an interesting inclusion in the archetype, and excited to see if Gruul Delirium is a little bit more likely to stay. And this is different than the Gruul Aggro deck that is running more of the mono red strategy and the Snakeskin Veil and such, right? So we've seen this archetype more prevalent for a while in best of 3 before it filtered down into best of 1, and it's had a fair amount of changes. Now it is favored against the Dimir Bounce deck, which has been a theme of this week. So we see a lot of counter for that deck, and which is also why we don't see the Dimir Bounce deck in the top 8. And It is a coin flip against mono black midrange, and it's weak against mono red aggro and Boros Auras. So it's another deck similar to the Azorius Oculus that I think is coming into play because we're seeing less play in the Boros Auras strategy. The opening hand, I think I have less reps with this deck, I must admit, but I look for the Patchwork Beastie in my opening hand, as well as the Fear of Missing Out. I think that those are the two critical cards to really get this archetype to shine. And now it's time for best of 3. So for best of 3, I like to follow the standard challenge on Magic the Gathering Online. It is a very competitive tournament that is held multiple times each week, and we see some top players, and a lot of the things that happen in the standard challenge are then reflected on the Magic the Gathering ladder on Arena. So number 1, first place on January 17th was Gruul Prowess by World Waker 2. And we do see a rather substantial change to the best of 3 sideboard, as well as some changes to the main. So we're dropping the 4 copies of the Monastery Swiftspear and bringing back the 4 copies of the Hired Claw. Last week we kind of talked about the pros and cons of Monastery Swiftspear versus Hired Claw. The Monastery Swiftspear is better because of the haste against sweepers, whereas the Hired Claw is better against the early threats because of being able to threaten into a 2/3. It can give you some early pressure. The pilot also brought in 2 additional copies of Questing Druid, and this one tends to be better in a meta that is more dominantly, has less aggro. So if you're coming up against other, Boros Prowess, Gruul Prowess, Mono Red Prowess, then the Questing Druids are usually worse to include in the main. And then we're dropping 1 copy of the Screaming Nemesis, which is also another sign that the pilot was not anticipating there to be as much aggro and wanted to start the deck favored against more of the mid-range and control matchups. We also see a decrease in the Burst Lightning, which reflects that as well, and the Snakeskin Veil, which reflects that as well, being able to react to your opponent's interaction. We do see the Torch the Tower coming in for the Burst Lightning, so it's just kind of a little bit of exile if you do want to get rid of a problematic blocker or recurring threat that needs to be exiled. Enduring Curiosity post-combat after it's been damaged. Enduring the Slasher, although we see that one less often in best of 3 now. The Mosswood Dread Knight and Golgari midrange. There's a couple of targets that like to be, you'd like to have the exile. And then we're dropping 1 copy of the Innkeeper's Talent. We see this one fluctuate all the way from 0 to 4, kind of just coming down to preference, and it is matchup dependent. It's worse against green and white, which has the enchantment removal, and then dropping 1 mountain, so going down a land. The best of 3 sideboard, we have down 1 Obliterating Bolt. The 2 Questing Druids have been moved to the main. Down 2 Snakeskin Veil, 1 which has been moved to the main, and down 2 Torch the Towers, 1 which has been moved to the main, and down 1 Witchstalker Frenzy. And the Witchstalker Frenzy pairing nicely with the Screaming Nemesis in some matchups, less so in others where it can get 2-for-1 by a card like Go for the Throat. And we're bringing in a 3rd copy of the Lithomantic Barrage, and I think this has to do with seeing a rise in the Azorius Oculus deck, but it's a good sideboard card against any white or blue strategy that's creature based. And then you have a additional Paw Patch Recruit. This one's good against the Unholy Annex in mono black X. Golgari midrange that's doing the Demons build. It's also good against the Azorius Oculus build, being able to target creatures with flying. It's good against the Slickshot Show-Off version of Gruul Aggro, which sometimes runs the Slickshot Show-Off. Being able to instant speed destroy creature with flying. So that, you can bring this in against, obviously, the enchantments deck in Domain with Zur. Anything that has good enchantment hits or flying hits, or both. And we've got 1 Pyroclasm, and this one's to answer the Go Wide strategies, which is typically mono-white tokens, or mono-white token control, or the Boros Mice deck has a Go Wide with all the Offspring. You can also use it as a relatively good counter to other Gruul Prowess decks, depending on when you draw your Pyroclasm, but it's just a 1-of anyway. And then the Scorching Shot is good against any of the 5 toughness creatures like Shieldred the Apocalypse, which can be a problem if they get that one down. And we have an additional copy of the Screaming Nemesis. If we do come up against a mono red deck, we can bring the 4th copy of the Screaming Nemesis in. And then this one this one caught me off guard. We have 2 copies of Sentinel of the Nameless City, and similar to this is also one that I think is probably good against the other aggro strategies. The Vigilance and the 4 Toughness can be difficult for your opponent to get over. And then the map tokens do have decent synergies with triggering your Valiant triggers off of your Heartfire Hero and your Emberheart Challenger. So curious to see that one, kind of a creative sideboard inclusion, and I think I like it. And then the Soulstone Sanctuary. This one, you can bring up a 3rd copy of the Soulstone Sanctuary against certain matchups. You can also tweak the amount of lands that you have. So on the play, you're going to want more lands than if you're on the draw. So when you're on the draw, you since you're drawing on your first turn, you can run a lower amount of lands. And so there's a little bit of that going on with the Soulstone Sanctuary. You can look at the Best of 3 sideboard guide that I have in the community tab. Will also give you kind of a decent idea to start your own sideboard strategy. Number 2 for the standard challenge on January 17th was Dimir Bounce by Oaf McNamara, and we see 2 cut downs have been dropped to bring in an additional copy of Go for the Throat and an additional copy of Hopeless Nightmare. And so, like I mentioned in Best of 1, this deck can be a little bit prone to your opponents overrunning you. In Best of 3, though, the curve outs are a little bit slower because of the not having the hand smoother in Best of 3. So that's a whole other topic and always starts a fight, so let's not go there. The Best of 3 sideboard, the rest of the deck is largely the same, or is exactly the same as last week. And the Best of 3 sideboard, we see Duress being dropped by 1. It's good against the control matchups that are going to try to disrupt you. You've got the Gix's Command going down by 1 as well. So, but Gix's Command comes in and goes depending on the meta, how much you anticipate there to be more of the mono red. So I think this one also reflects, this pilot was anticipating less. And same with the Preacher of the Schism. So dropping 1 copy of the Preacher of the Schism from 3 to 2. And this is a card that you usually bring in against a deck that is faster than you, that can help you stabilize. Worse if you're up against something that's going slower. And then we're bringing in a Ghost Vacuum, again, probably to reflect the increase in Azorius Oculus. But this card is also useful in the mirror match against any of the decks running the Enduring Curiosities or the Enduring Vitality and Temur Otters, because this does go to the graveyard before it returns to the battlefield as an enchantment. You can then snag it with the Ghost Vacuum. And we're also running 2 copies of the Malicious Eclipse. So we do have an answer for the go wide strategies if we are coming up against the Boros Mice deck or the Gruul Prowess deck or the Mono Red Prowess deck. Malicious Eclipse is a pretty good answer for that strategy. First place on January 18th was Esper Bounce by Ruby Exilia. And this is a very similar strategy to the Dimir Bounce, but we're bringing in white. And so it's a little bit less consistent mana-wise, but the loops are a little bit more substantiated by the inclusion of the Nurturing Pixie, which then allows you to pick stuff up and can be bounced itself to pick stuff up, allows you to kind of do those loops a little bit more consistently. This one is dropping 2 copies of the Spiteful Hexmage, and which is the 3/2 that creates a cursed roll. And we're instead running the 2 copies of the Mockingbird. And the Mockingbird leans further into having multiple copies of your creatures that bounce. And it also gives you an evasive flyer that you can play on 1 if you're going for a turn 3 ninjutsu with Kaido. Sometimes on the play, that can be enough to win the game. So the Best of 3 sideboard also got a rework, so we're dropping the 3 copies of the Destroy Evil, which is the destroy target enchantment or destroy creature with toughness 4 or greater. And we're dropping a Kaido and 2 pest controls, which was the sweeper that was being explored last week. And we're bringing in 3 Break the Spells, which I like because it's cheaper for this deck. If your Destroy Evil is always destroying an enchantment, then just play Break the Spell instead. So I like that inclusion, and we'll see if that one's here to stay. The bringing in the 2nd copy of the Cut Down helps out against the early aggression, which this deck can struggle with. and bringing in a third copy of Rest in Peace. Now, personally, I don't really care for the third copy of Rest in Peace because they do not do well in duplicates. If you are coming up against a lot of strategies that are requiring the graveyard, which like the Enduring Curiosity going to the graveyard, the Heartfire Hero gets exiled instead, so it doesn't deal damage to you. Azorius Oculus obviously really cares about the graveyard strategy. Any of the Reanimator strategies like Azorius Omniscience, which we have seen come more into the best of 3 tournament scene, all rely on their graveyard, so Rest in Peace may be worth bringing up to the third copy, and this pilot certainly thought so. And then the inclusion of Tithing Blade, which we saw originally included, I think, in the main, being brought in on the sideboard here in case you have something that is a large problematic threat, especially one that has like Thrun, right? Thrun the can be a problem in Golgari midrange because you can't target it without a green spell, and so Tithing Blade is a good way to get around some problematic threats like that. All right, we've got Azorius Oculus by Batutinha, and similar to what we saw in Best of 1, we see an increase in Azorius Oculus in Best of 3 because it is a good answer to the Dimir and Esper Bounce strategies. So we have to go all the way back to week 2, since the last time we talked about Azorius Oculus taking down one of these tournaments, or getting a first or second place in one of these tournaments, and so this version is dropping the 2 split-ups in the main. It's bringing in an additional Soul Partition and an additional copy of Negate, and is dropping in an island for a Darker Waste. So largely the same. And again, if you're looking for inspiration for your best of 1 deck as far as the lands go, this one is even bringing in the Undercity Sewers without any black to get the additional Surveil, and to try to get a turn 2 Abhorrent Oculus. It does happen. And the sideboard also got a pretty substantial rework. So we're dropping the 3 copies of Authority of the Consuls, which is the enchantment that makes your opponent's creatures enter tapped and you gain 1 life. It's a really great answer to Urabrask's Forge, but by and large we've seen Urabrask's Forge disappear from the meta because of Authority of Consuls. Beza, the Bounding Spring, has been removed, which is the mid-range threat that gains you life and creates the 1/1s. Exercise has been dropped 1 copy, which is the Destroy Artifact enchantment or power 4 or greater, and we're dropping the 3 copies of the Fairy Mastermind, which was something that wasn't typically included in the archetype that was kind of being explored. Dropping 2 Lauren of the Third Paths, which also give you artifact and enchantment hate, and dropping 1 split up in the main, or sorry, in the sideboard, and we're bringing in a Destroy Evil. This one largely like an Exercise, but works better against cards like Preacher of the Schism. We also have 2 copies of the Elspeth Smite to counter the aggro strategies, which this deck can struggle with. And we're bringing in 2 copies of the Ghost Vacuum, which is good against the mirror match, but also good, as I mentioned, against the enduring targets. There's some, yeah, sometimes, you know, the Ghost Vacuum can be particularly nice, good against the Omniscience decks. And then we're bringing in 3 copies of the Monastery Mentor. This is kind of the card you bring in if they're bringing in Graveyard Hate, so that you're less dependent on the graveyard. And then we have 3 copies of the Temporary Lockdown. And Temporary Lockdown versus Split Up, they both have pros and cons. Temporary Lockdown being able to exile anything 2 or less, whereas Split Up can hit larger creatures, but they do have to be tapped or untapped. And so kind of a preference call on the Temporary Lockdown and matchup dependent. And number 1 on January 18th, because there's 2 sets of that tournament, is Mono Red Prowess by Sarlanga. So we have to go back to week 2, which I think was either the World Championship or it was close to the World Championship, right? So this one is no changes from the World Championship deck. This is the one that is largely considered the core build of Mono Red that we see changes happening to each week in Best of 1. And but we do see a couple of tweaks to the Best of 3 sideboard. So we're dropping 1 copy of Torch the Tower and the 3 copies of the Urabrask's Forge, because again, it has not been performing well against cards like the Authority of the Consuls. And instead, we're bringing in an additional copy of the Lithomantic Barrage, lots of blue and white in the meta right now. 2 copies of the Pyroclasm for the other go wide strategies and other aggro strategies with small things and small mice, the Prowess decks. And then we're bringing in an additional copy of the Sunspine Lynx, which can really punish the 3-color mana base of Esper Bounce, but is also a classic against Domain. Anything that has a lot of lands in their in their main that are non-basics, then this can punish that strategy quite heavily. And then also players can't gain life fits into this Screaming Nemesis, can be relevant, specifically stopping them gaining 2 life off of like Shieldred the Apocalypse, etc. Right? So glad to see Mono Red Prowess back. It's one of my favorites for the ladder, personally. All right, and the last 2 are going to be really small changes, so we'll just go through them really quickly. So, second place on January 18th was taken down by Azorius Oculus by Beekeeper, and they also dropped 1 copy of Split Up instead of 2 to bring in a Soul Partition, but not the Negate. So compared to the other lists, they've dropped a Negate to bring in the Split Up. And the best of 3 sideboard then largely reflects that change, so nothing substantial here. They brought in the Negate in the sideboard and dropped a temporary lockdown because they kept the 1 Split Up. And then for January 19th on Sunday, which is the big tournament, first place was taken down by Esper Bounce by Misplaced Ginger, but it was the same list as Ruby Exilia, so we won't be covering that one. And this version of Dimir Bounce by Oaf McNamara is very similar, no changes to the same list that they were running back on the 17th, right? So no changes to the main. There is a slight change to the sideboard that we'll mention before we wrap things up here, which is they dropped 2 copies of the Preacher of the Schism, so no longer having that as an option at all, and instead brought in Blotout, which is a card that we've seen quite a bit against the other Dimir mid-range decks a couple weeks ago, because Kaido and Enduring Curiosity tend to be the most expensive cards in the Dimir Bounce, but also the Dimir mid-range builds, if they're not running the Shieldred. Gives you a good target to get around the hexproof of Kaido and get rid of the kind of stickiness of the Curiosity because it exiles. So this is kind of a Dimir-specific hate, in my opinion. And then the Witch's Vanity is one that we talked about last week, and I like the inclusion here against the aggro matchups. If you were running this on the arena ladder where you see more aggro, I would definitely consider the Witch's Vanity. It makes me think of Cabeza de los Bolos build with Orsov Pixie back before everything was Dimir, back in like Duskmorn. So or maybe even further back than that. But anyway, many moons ago, we talked about Witch's Vanity and its interactions in a bounce deck, and it works particularly well against aggro. So thanks as always to listening to my ramblings each week. I do enjoy doing this, and it does take a fair amount of time out of my day to do this. So I appreciate those who have joined as a YouTube member and have tried to help me out monetarily. So thank you for your support. And with that, though, good luck with your ladder climb, good luck with your RCQs, and as always, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me in the comments. I do my best to reply to each one. So take care, everybody, and tomorrow we'll be doing the community deck techs, which is another favorite thing I love to do on this channel. So thank you.